They present it as a system of achievement, suggesting that diligence and saving will lead to upward mobility, and that the American promise is accessible to all who strive for it. However, if this narrative holds true, why are we witnessing wealth accumulating at an unprecedented pace? Why do the affluent continue to increase their fortunes while the majority fall further behind? In 1980, the wealthiest 1% held approximately 7% of the nation's assets. Presently, that figure stands at 32%. This shift isn't attributable to a sudden surge in their work ethic, enhanced intelligence, or groundbreaking innovation, but rather to a deliberate reconfiguration of the economic framework to channel wealth upwards. Once you comprehend the actual workings of this system, you will realize that this outcome is not accidental nor a market malfunction, it is by design. The wealthy prosper because the rules are manipulated in their favor. The less fortunate falter because every regulation, every policy, and every crisis is orchestrated to extract resources from the lower strata and funnel them to the apex. This discussion transcends individual triumphs or failures. It concerns a complex apparatus, a wealth extraction mechanism that has been operational for decades, with you serving as the primary fuel. Let us commence with the most foundational mechanism, asset appreciation, juxtaposed with wage stagnation. Since 1971, when President Nixon detached the dollar from its gold backing, the government acquired the capacity to generate an unlimited supply of currency, a power it readily exercised. Trillions of dollars were conjured from nothing. The crucial point, however, is that this newly created wealth did not find its way to the general populace. Instead, it was injected into the financial system, inflating the values of stocks, bonds, real estate, and virtually all assets owned by the affluent. If you possessed assets in 1980, you were positioned for success. Your property's value likely tripled, your stock portfolio experienced explosive growth, and your investment properties generated substantial wealth. Conversely, if your primary asset was your labor, your sole commodity being your time and skills, you experienced a decline as wages saw minimal increases. Between 1980 and 2020, worker productivity surged by 70%, while corporate profits soared by over 400%. In contrast, real wages, adjusted for inflation, saw an increase of merely about 10%. Consider this disparity. You're operating 70% more efficiently than previous generations, generating 70% more value, yet your take-home pay has remained largely stagnant. Where did that additional 60% go? Directly to the top, benefiting shareholders, executives, and those who own the assets. Allow me to provide a tangible illustration. In 1980, the average chief executive officer earned approximately 40 times the income of an average worker. Today, CEOs command over 350 times the earnings of their employees. This colossal divergence is not a consequence of CEOs becoming 10 times more adept at their roles, but rather a fundamental shift in executive compensation from fixed salaries to stock options. The value of these stocks has been propelled skyward by currency creation, stock buybacks, and financial engineering. Meanwhile, the workers who physically construct products, serve customers, and generate revenue continue to receive hourly wages that barely keep pace with inflation. This represents wealth extraction by deliberate design. Those at the pinnacle have reoriented their compensation structures to capitalize on asset inflation, while those at the base are confined to wages, which consistently lose ground to assets in an inflationary environment. Now, let us address access to credit, a facet where the system's predatory nature becomes starkly apparent. Wealthy individuals secure loans at approximately 3% interest, while those with limited means often face rates as high as 23%. This discrepancy, compounded over time, creates vast generational fortunes for some and perpetuates a cycle of poverty for others. If you possess significant wealth and assets that can serve as collateral, financial institutions will extend credit at remarkably low rates. You can secure a mortgage at 3% to acquire rental properties, obtain business loans at 4% to expand your enterprise, or leverage your stock portfolio at 2% to invest in further assets. Given that asset values are escalating at a pace exceeding your interest rate, you essentially profit simply from borrowing. This is precisely how the affluent leverage debt to augment their wealth. They borrow at low rates against appreciating assets, allowing inflation and appreciation to effectively cover the loan repayments while they retain the profits. However, for those without assets, credit transforms into a financial trap. To commute to work, you require a vehicle necessitating a loan at 12% interest. In the depths of winter, a malfunctioning furnace compels you to utilize a credit card at 23%. Pursuing higher education might lead to student loans that burden you indefinitely. Each instance of borrowing incurs a substantial premium solely due to your financial standing. This interest constitutes pure profit for financial institutions, which then flows upwards to shareholders and executives. To illustrate concretely, an affluent individual borrows $1 million at 3% interest to purchase an investment property. Their annual interest outlay amounts to $30,000, yet the property appreciates at an annual rate of 5%, yielding $50,000. They are effectively earning $20,000 annually simply through the act of borrowing. Conversely, an individual with limited resources borrows $20,000 on credit cards at 23% interest. Their annual interest cost is $4,600, and they are not acquiring an asset that appreciates in value. Rather, they are purchasing necessities like groceries and covering essential repairs, items that inherently depreciate or are consumed. Thus, the wealthy individual is compensated for borrowing, while the less fortunate individual is financially depleted. This is the interest rate trap, one of the most potent mechanisms for wealth redistribution within the existing framework. Now let us examine taxation, the domain where appropriation becomes entirely legal. The tax code is drafted by and for the wealthy, meticulously designed to levy taxes on labor rather than on wealth itself. If your livelihood depends on employment, you are subject to income tax at federal, state, and local levels, accumulating a significant burden. The average worker pays roughly 30% of their income in taxes. However, if your income derives from investments, you are taxed under capital gains regulations with a maximum rate of 20%. You are already paying less, but the situation becomes more disadvantageous. The truly affluent often avoid capital gains taxes altogether by employing a strategy known as buy, borrow, die. Here's how it functions. Imagine you possess stocks valued at $100 million. Instead of liquidating them and incurring capital gains tax, you borrow against their value. Financial institutions will extend a $20 million loan at a low interest rate, using your stocks as collateral. You then subsist on this borrowed money, which is not subject to income tax. Consequently, you pay zero income tax and zero capital gains tax, living solely on loans. Upon your demise, your heirs inherit the stocks with a stepped-up basis, meaning the original cost is reset to the current market value. They can then sell the stocks without incurring any tax liability. The proceeds are subsequently used to repay your loans, ensuring the entire fortune is transferred tax-free. This is how billionaires achieve lower effective tax rates than their administrative assistants. It is legal, commonplace, and exclusively accessible to the exceedingly wealthy. Meanwhile, you are taxed on every dollar you earn. You cannot borrow against your future wages at 2% interest, nor can you pass on your earnings to your children without incurring taxes. You are subjected to the highest tax rates on the most vulnerable form of wealth, your labor. This is an intentional feature, as labor cannot be hidden offshore, sheltered in trusts, or exploited through loopholes. You report for work, you are compensated, and you are taxed, with the revenue flowing upwards. Let us revisit history to observe this pattern with clarity. The Gilded Age, spanning from 1870 to 1900, witnessed a select group of industrialists, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Vanderbilt, amassing fortunes so immense they commanded entire industries: oil, steel, banking, and railroads. They controlled the nation's infrastructure, and everyone else worked for them. Wages were meager, working conditions were appalling, child labor was prevalent, and there were no safety regulations, minimum wage laws, or overtime provisions. When laborers attempted to organize and demand better pay or conditions, the wealthy deployed private security forces, such as the Pinkertons, who were effectively hired gunmen to suppress strikes, even resorting to deadly force against workers. This era did not embody capitalism, but rather a form of feudalism with industrial workplaces concentrating wealth to levels unseen since the European aristocracy. It required decades of labor activism, strikes, and eventual governmental intervention to dismantle these monopolies and establish a degree of equilibrium. The New Deal, the rise of labor unions, and progressive taxation were all initiatives designed to prevent wealth concentration from reaching a point that would undermine democracy. For a period, these measures were effective. From 1945 to 1980, income inequality declined, the middle class expanded, and wages rose in tandem with productivity, marking the most economically equitable period in American history. However, this trend reversed. Commencing in 1980, all policy shifts favored capital over labor. Tax reductions for the wealthy, suppression of unionization, deregulation of the financial sector, and globalization that facilitated the offshoring of jobs, leading to an explosive widening of the wealth gap. We have now regressed to Gilded Age levels of inequality. The affluent control a larger share of the nation's assets than they did in 1929, on the eve of the Great Depression. Mirroring the Gilded Age, this concentrated wealth is being leveraged to acquire political influence, stifle labor organization, and manipulate the rules to their advantage. History is repeating itself, albeit through more sophisticated mechanisms that often go unnoticed by the general populace. While Rockefeller employed monopolies and hired muscle, today's billionaires utilize tax havens and lobbying efforts, different tools, yielding the same outcome: wealth accumulation at the top, concentrated power, and widespread economic disenfranchisement. Now let us address the role of crises, moments when wealth transfer accelerates. Every economic downturn in modern history has served to enrich the affluent while impoverishing the less fortunate. Consider the crisis of 2008. Financial institutions engaged in risky mortgage-backed securities trading, nearly precipitating a global economic collapse. Millions of ordinary citizens lost their homes, jobs, and savings, with widespread foreclosures devastating entire communities and retirement accounts being halved. It was the most severe economic catastrophe since the Great Depression, and what befell those responsible? They received bailouts. The government injected trillions of dollars into the banking system. Taxpayer funds were channeled to Wall Street, which then utilized this capital to acquire foreclosed properties at significantly reduced prices. Entities like BlackRock, private equity firms, and hedge funds procured hundreds of thousands of homes while ordinary individuals faced eviction. Consequently, these corporations are now your landlords, charging you rent for properties you once owned. The 2008 crisis represented the most substantial upward wealth transfer in American history, accomplished with public funds. Then came 2020. The onset of the pandemic led to widespread economic shutdowns and the infusion of $6 trillion by the government to prevent total collapse. While some of this reached individuals through stimulus checks averaging around $1,200, with some receiving up to $2,000, the vast majority was directed towards corporations and financial markets. The stock market, which had plummeted in March of 2020, recovered completely by June and reached all-time highs by the end of the year. This was facilitated by the Federal Reserve's injection of trillions into the financial system, including bond purchases and the maintenance of near-zero interest rates, which artificially inflated asset prices. Those who owned stocks experienced significant wealth gains, with the wealthiest Americans adding over $1 trillion to their net worth during the pandemic, marking the most profitable year for billionaires. Simultaneously, millions of workers lost their jobs, small businesses shuttered permanently, renters struggled to meet payments and faced eviction, and inflation began to erode any remaining savings. Once again, the crisis disproportionately benefited the wealthy while exacerbating the economic hardship of the majority. This pattern, where printed money inflates asset values while diminishing purchasing power, is consistently observed. Notice the recurring theme: a crisis emerges, the government intervenes, currency is printed, this influx of capital flows to the top, asset prices rebound or even surge, while wages remain stagnant, jobs are not fully restored, and individuals at the lower economic strata are left with increased debt, inflation, and diminished resources. This is not a system flaw, it is its inherent operational mechanism. Crises serve as opportune moments for wealth redistribution, a reality understood by those in positions of power. Let us explore the concept of compound returns, the mathematical engine driving inequality. If you commence with $1 million and achieve an 8% annual return, your wealth will grow to $2.1 million in 10 years, $4.6 million in 20 years, and $10 million in 30 years, all without any additional effort beyond owning assets that appreciate. Conversely, if you start with nothing, relying solely on your labor, your income is linear. You work, you are paid, and when you cease working, the income stops. There is no compounding effect, and inflation continuously erodes your purchasing power. Consequently, the economic chasm between you and someone who began with $1 million widens progressively, not due to superior intellect or diligence, but due to the immutable laws of mathematics. Compound returns on assets will invariably outpace linear income derived from labor. This explains the profound significance of inheritances and the near insurmountable challenge of overcoming inherited wealth disparities. If your parents provide no financial foundation, you begin from zero. Even with aggressive saving and prudent investment, you will likely never catch up to someone who started with a substantial inheritance. The mathematics simply do not permit it. Now let us introduce an additional factor: inflation. When the government prints money, it inflates asset values. Homes, stocks, gold, and all other commodities increase in price. If you own these assets, your wealth grows. However, if you do not, and are attempting to purchase your first home or save for retirement, the cost of these essential goods and services escalates beyond your reach, further widening the economic divide. This is why the housing market is in disarray. In 1980, the median home price was approximately $64,000, while the median household income was around $21,000, meaning a home cost roughly 3 times your annual earnings. Today, the median home price exceeds $400,000, with the median income hovering around $75,000, making a home cost more than 5 times your annual income. However, the situation is more dire. While mortgage rates in 1980 were high, approximately 13%, homes were affordable, allowing for relatively rapid repayment. In contrast, despite lower interest rates today, home prices are so exorbitant that even at a 4% interest rate, the monthly mortgage payment is financially burdensome. Furthermore, with a 30-year repayment term, you dedicate a larger portion of your income to housing for an extended period, accumulating equity at a slower pace. Concurrently, existing property owners are witnessing an explosion in their net worth, having acquired assets at lower valuations that are now worth millions without any additional effort on their part. The system simply inflated the value of their pre-existing holdings. The stark reality is that the system is engineered to reward those who begin with capital and penalize those who rely solely on labor. Capital benefits from inexpensive credit, reduced taxation, and compounding returns. Labor, conversely, is burdened by costly credit, higher taxes, and linear income. Capital thrives amidst inflation, while labor is devastated by it. Capital possesses mobility, enabling it to relocate to jurisdictions with lower tax burdens, whereas labor is constrained, preventing effortless relocation to avoid taxation. Every regulation, policy, and crisis response is formulated to safeguard capital and extract value from labor. And it is those who control capital who dictate these rules, finance political campaigns, own media outlets, and shape public discourse. Therefore, you are led to believe that economic disparity stems from merit, hard work, or personal choices. In reality, it is a consequence of a system that incentivizes ownership and penalizes employment. What then are the key takeaways? Firstly, understand that you cannot out-earn a rigged system. Working harder will not lead to wealth if the framework is designed to transfer your productivity to others. Acquiring assets rather than solely earning income is essential. Secondly, recognize that debt functions as a weapon against you. Costly debt perpetuates poverty, while accessible, inexpensive debt can facilitate wealth accumulation, though the system ensures such credit is primarily available to those who already possess financial resources. Thirdly, The tax code is not impartial. It is structured to favor wealth over labor. Familiarize yourself with its intricacies or engage professionals who possess this knowledge, as the affluent meticulously exploit every available loophole. Fourthly, crises are periods of wealth redistribution. The next significant downturn is inevitable, and during such times, assets will become available at discounted prices. Possessing cash, liquidity, or access to credit will enable you to acquire these assets. Conversely, you may find yourself in a position of selling at a loss. Fifthly, generational wealth is a critical factor. If you cannot inherit it, you must endeavor to build it, which necessitates present-day sacrifice to accumulate assets that will appreciate over time. Historical patterns consistently demonstrate this trend. Wealth concentrates, the affluent amass greater fortunes, and the less fortunate experience further impoverishment. This phenomenon has occurred in Rome, feudal Europe, and the Gilded Age, and it is presently unfolding. The only instances where this pattern reversed were when workers unified, actively resisted, and compelled systemic change. The labor movement of the early 20th century, the New Deal, and the post-war economic prosperity were all achieved through concerted struggle. None of these advancements were granted freely. Currently, these gains are being systematically eroded. Labor unions have diminished in strength, taxes on the wealthy have been reduced, wages remain stagnant, and wealth is concentrating at an accelerated rate. We are regressing towards a neo-feudalistic society characterized by a minuscule elite owning virtually all assets, while the remainder of the population exists by renting, borrowing, and working until their demise, unless a collective awakening and demand for fundamental change occur. However, the harsh reality is that the majority will not act. The system is exceptionally adept at maintaining public distraction, division, and desperation. Individuals are too preoccupied with working multiple jobs to organize, too encumbered by debt to take risks, and too focused on immediate survival to contemplate the broader implications. This is precisely the intended outcome, as a populace struggling for basic necessities lacks the capacity or inclination to mount resistance. While history does not precisely repeat itself, its patterns are undeniably discernible. The wealthy accumulate more resources because the system is designed for wealth concentration. The less fortunate experience further economic decline because every mechanism, credit, taxation, inflation, crises, operates to extract value from the bottom and transfer it to the top. This is not an anomaly, it is the fundamental design. Until this reality is grasped, one will continue to participate in a contest that is inherently unwinnable. If this analysis has offered a novel perspective, consider subscribing. History holds the answers. I will guide you to them.